No Talkings, chapters 11 and 12. Questions and answers. In all her years of teaching, 17 in total, Mrs. Marlowe had never walked into a quieter classroom full of students. It was a new experience for her. It was also new for the kids. Dave watched Mrs. Marlowe go to the front of the room and pick up her attendance book. The teacher looked at the list of names in the book, looked up and down the rows of the class, looked at the book again, and said, "I thought maybe I was wrong in the room. Pretty quiet in here today. Can someone tell me why?" No hands went up. But Mrs. Marlowe was watching for anything that might give her a clue about this unusual behavior. And after a question, she saw a few sly glances between kids, and she noticed some of them trying to hide a smile. She knew what those looks and smiles meant. These kids were keeping a secret. Time for her first experiment. Looking over the class, Mrs. Marlowe settled her eyes on Seth Townsend, smiled, and said, "So, Seth, did you do your science homework last night?" With no hesitation, Seth smiled back and said, "Yes, I did." Mrs. Marlowe looked at Amy Gilson and said, "How about you, Amy?" She nodded and said, "It was hard." "Really? Why did you think was hard about it?" she asked. Amy scrunched up her face and then said, "Too much math." Her answer got a lot of nods and a few laughs from the other kids, but then it went completely quiet again. Mrs. Marlowe couldn't get over how beautifully these children were behaving. Just yesterday, she had asked one student a question, and about 15 others had blurted out answers, and then the whole class began arguing. And that started a huge free-for-all that didn't end until she banged on her desk with a book. It was always like that with this class, and with the other fifth grade classes too. But not today. No one talked at all, unless she asked a question, which gave Miss Marlowe an idea. "Please get out your homework sheets." There was a lot of rustling and bustling as the students obeyed. "Now," she said, "Ellen, look at problem 1. How did you decide if given the quantities were reasonable?" Helen rifled through her papers, and the look on her face surprised Miss Marlowe. Ellen looked scared. It was one of the standard questions about science problems, a question the whole class was used to, but the girls seemed completely confused. Mrs. Marlowe could see that she'd done the assignment. Plus, Ellen was one of the best science students. What was she scared about? After a few moments of what looked like absolute panic, Ellen calmed down. Then very slowly she said, "The numbers worked." Mrs. Marlowe waited for the rest of her explanation. It didn't come. "Right," she said, "and I made estimates," Ellen said. Again, her words came slowly, and there was another long pause. "And," the teacher urged, "I used math." Mrs. Marlowe nodded. "Of course you used math, but I want to hear about your process, your thinking." Ellen said, "I did comparing." Frustrated, Mrs. Marlowe turned to the other side of the room. "Dave, tell us your answer you got for problem 1 and explain your process." Dave didn't look scared, but he also took a long time to respond. Too long for Mrs. Marlowe. She said, "I'd like your answer today, Mr. Packer." Dave said, 440. 440 what? Prompted Mrs. Marlowe. "Barrels of oil," said Dave slowly. "Per," said Mrs. Marlowe. Dave said, "per day." "Wrong," said Mrs. Marlowe. "Look at your work and tell me what you forgot." She was losing her patience. Dave frowned and squinted at his paper. He nodded and then slowly said, "The first day." A ripple of giggles swept through the room. Girl giggles. Mrs. Marlowe snapped. "Since when did wrong answers become funny?" The science teacher thought, "Are they all pretending to be stupid today? Is that it?" Whatever was going on, she didn't like it. It was disruptive. It was slowing down her class. It was annoying. And suddenly, Mrs. Marlowe was in no mood for games. She was not going to play along. If these kids wanted quiet, then that's what they were going to get. She glared around the room. Pass in your papers. Everyone obeyed without a word. Open to chapter 4 and read. The homework is on the board. The next 34 minutes in the science room passed in complete silence, except for the rustle of paper and the occasional cough or sniffle. And sitting at her desk, Mrs. Marlowe had to admit that she enjoyed the quiet, enjoyed not having to fight the battle of the mouth every second with these kids. The unshushables were completely shushed. All right, very weird. But the science teacher wasn't any close to figuring out why the kids were acting this way. Dave felt something hit his arm, then drop onto his leg. It was a note. He glanced at Mrs. Marlowe. All clear. So he slowly reached down, picked up the note, and unfolded it. You said, the first day. Counts as a word. So you said 4, and you cost the boys 1 whole point, loser. Ha ha, Lindsay. Dave knew Lindsay was sitting 2 seats back on his left, and he knew she was waiting for him to turn around so she could give him a sickly, sweet little smile. So he didn't turn around, but he felt the tops of his ears getting pink, and he began thinking of a million things he wished he could say to her, all sorts of clever insults, like, if brains were money, you'd be broke, or, wow, you can count to 4, or, I had a pet turtle that, Mr. Packer, bring it here. Dave snapped to attention and looked to see Mrs. Marlowe staring at him, holding out her hand. Putting on his best innocent face, Dave said, What? The note. Here. As Dave walked up and dropped the note onto Mrs. Marlowe's hand, the bell rang. Mrs. Marlowe tucked the paper into her pocket and then slowly stood up quickly, because when the bell rang, she had to hurry out her door to try to maintain law and order between classes in the hallway. But of course, there was no need for the corridor police, not today. Mrs. Marlowe watched all the 5th graders move from room to room, smiling, making faces, waving, nodding at each other. There were a few laughs and whistles, and she heard Tyler Renner make a loud snort in the general direction of some girls, but there was no talking. She looked across the hall and caught Mrs. Escobar's eye, and they both smiled and then shrugged at each other. And since there wasn't any patrol work to do, Mrs. Marlowe reached into her pocket and pulled out the captured note, and she read it. For a logical person like Mrs. Marlowe, Lindsay's note to Dave was like a Rosetta Stone, a key that helped her begin to understand what she had seen and heard on the playground, and then in her classroom. So, this whole thing was something about counting words. More than 3 words resulted in a penalty, which explained all those short answers from Ellen and Dave. And it was boys against the girls. Nothing new about that, not with this group. And they were all trying to keep quiet. Mrs. Marlowe remembered the Jinx game from her own school years, when 2 people said the same word at the same time and then had to keep quiet. Maybe it was like that. Except this wasn't 2 people. It was more than 125 of the most talkative children on planet Earth. As chunks of the puzzle began to fall into place, Mrs. Marlowe immediately thought, the others are going to love this. She meant the other teachers. But then her scientific curiosity kicked in and she thought, why spoil the kids' experiment? And I should really let the other teachers figure things out on their own. And of course, my preliminary findings could be wrong. I should certainly gather more data before I present my theory to the scholarly committee. And as Mrs. Marlowe chuckled at her private joke, she said to herself, kids. Chapter 12, Guessing Games. Tuesday afternoon in the 5th grade hall was a challenge for everyone. Mrs. Akers walked into the music room, sat at her piano, smiled, and said, My, you are all behaving so well this afternoon. Wonderful. Now please open your school books to This Land is Your Land. As she played the introduction on the piano, she said, back straight, big smiles, deep breaths, and no one sang. The piano stopped mid-measure, and Mrs. Akers frowned at the class. Now I know you can all do better than that. She began the introduction again, counting in the beats. 1 and 2 and 3. This land is your land, this land. Mrs. Akers stopped. She was singing a solo, and her high, quivering voice made the kids giggle. She frowned again. All right, students, this is not funny, and it's not good. We have less than 2 weeks before our Thanksgiving program, and we have no time for this kind of silliness. She pointed at a bright fingernail around the room. Brian, Tommy, Anna, every one of you, I want to hear you sing. She banged out the introduction again, and the whole class sang, This land is, and then stopped. The piano kept playing. Mrs. Akers bellowed, Sing! And most of the kids jumped in on, My land from, and then stopped. After another shouted command, they sang, The redwood forest. And that's how the whole song went, chopped up into 3-word bits. And when Miss Akers, her face bright red by this point, thumping on her piano, and said, What is wrong with you today? The kids didn't say a word. Like all teachers, Mrs. Akers understood the divide and conquer rule. When you need to get to the bottom of something, you don't ask the whole class, you ask one student. So she pointed at Lena in the front row and said, Why aren't you singing? Lena hesitated and then motioned to all the kids around the room and said, Not talking today. Mrs. Akers said, What's that supposed to mean, not talking? Lena nodded. Only 3 words. The music teacher was even more puzzled. She pointed at James and asked, Explain. James had trouble expressing himself even under the best conditions. He gulped and took a deep breath, and then he said, No, not words. Everyone. A light dawned on Mrs. Akers' face, and still talked to James. She said, Oh, so it's like the project kids do. Like when they take a vow of silence to protest how there's still slavery in Africa. I read about that. Is that it? James looked lost. He shook his head. Hard. Explain. Not. But Mrs. Akers felt like she had answered the riddle, or maybe partially answered it. And whatever was happening, she decided to be a good sport. Looking around the room, she said, So tell me, can you all hum? Is humming allowed? Everyone grinned and nodded like maniacs. How about clapping? Can you clap a rhythm? More smiles and nods. All right then, here we go again. And she ripped back into the piano. 1, 2, and 3. And 24 fifth graders clapped and hummed along as Mrs. Akers played all 7 verses of This Land is Your Land. Then the whole class giggled and laughed and hummed and clapped their way through other 4 songs on the Thanksgiving program. And they all survived their first wordless music class. The 5th period gym class was less dramatic than music. News had gotten to most of the teachers that the 5th graders had gone quiet, which didn't bother the gym teacher at all. Tuesday was dodgeball day, so Mrs. Henley appointed to the 2 captains, and then the captains picked their teams by pointing, and the first game got underway, all without a word. Dodgeball, which can be a pretty serious anyways, seemed especially grim without the talking and shouting. There were the usual grunts of effort and screams of terror, and when 3 or 4 kids with red dodgeballs would go silently hunting for one player on the other team, it was sort of like watching a pack of wolves go after a lone caribou. A motion of the leader's head, a movement toward the prey, and then whack, whack, whomp, dead meat. From the teacher's point of view, dodgeball was all about improving reflexes and getting a good, large motor skills workout to accomplish those goals without any of the taunting and teasing and name-calling. That was just fine by her. Even so, Mrs. Henley watched all 3 games with great interest. She saw how the kids communicated without words, and she noticed herself pointing and shaking her head and blowing her whistle instead of yelling. It was nice to give her voice a rest. Mr. Burton taught 5th grade reading and language arts. He was puzzled at the beginning of class right after lunch, and like the music teacher and the science teacher, he asked questions and got 3-word answers. But he kept at it, and after about 5 minutes, he figured out what was going on, at least part of it. Unlike Mrs. Marlowe, Mr. Burton had a lot of patience and a pretty good sense of humor, and he couldn't see any real problem with having these kids being this well behaved. Anything that got the unshushables quiet was fine with him. Plus, he decided they could all have some fun with this limit of 3 words in a row. He picked a funny story from the reading textbook, a really short one, and he had the kids read it out loud, 3 words, each as fast as possible, with him calling out the name of the next narrator. And when the story was finished, he said, "Okay, now I want you to make up a story." He picked up a meter stick and said, "When I point at you, you say a 3-word sentence, and listen carefully so you can make the story move forward. Here we go." The story started like this. A woman screamed. She was scared. It was dark. "Oh no, snakes!" One bit her. "Ow, my leg!" She limped outside. Her neighbor came. "What's wrong?" "Snakes are everywhere." "Are they poisonous?" "Yes, and smelly." "Quick, my car." "You saved me." "Darn, dead battery." Round and round the room the story went. The poor woman and her neighbor were eventually eaten by the huge orange lizards that came up out of the sewers and ripped the roof off the car. The lizards also ate all the snakes. But then some ugly tulips in the garden grew razor blade teeth and ate the lizards. Then the tulips burped giant burps, which created a tornado that made the Statue of Liberty fall over and crush a tugboat, which made a wave that crashed all the way to the White House and got muddy water all over the president's polka-dotted underpants. It was quite a tale. The period ended, and as the students walked quietly out of the room, Mr. Burton got a lot of waves and smiles and thumbs up. He waved and smiled back at the kids. No words were needed. It had been a fun class, fun, creative, lively, and everyone had used their word skills in new ways. Mr. Burton felt great. The next 40 minutes was his planning period, and then came the last class of the day, period 7. He had some papers to grade, but Mr. Burton was too excited because what these kids were doing, well, it felt like a once-in-a-lifetime chance to mess around with words and language and communication and try something fresh, something special. After all, science teachers aren't the only people who like a good experiment. So Mr. Burton sat at his desk thinking and thinking. Finally, with about 2 minutes before period 7, he got it. A great idea. Plus, he realized that this situation could be useful to him in a totally unexpected way. And as the bell rang, Mr. Burton noticed that he was actually looking forward to his last class of the afternoon. Another proof that this was not an ordinary day.